It's 3 o'clock, so let's start. Welcome everyone to the first online Hot Politics Lab meeting on Zoom. Welcome to everyone. We currently have 32 participants, so that's, well, I guess 3 times as much as usual. So that's good to see. Welcome to everyone. A little bit of introduction first about the Hot Politics Lab. The Hot Politics Lab is a lab based at the University of Amsterdam. It's an interdisciplinary research group that tries to use political psychology to talk about a whole range of political and social situations. It's founded by me, Gijs Schumacher. I'm an associate professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam. It's by Bert Bakker, who is an assistant professor at the Communication Science Department, and Matthijs Roduin, who is also an assistant professor at the Political Science Department. Same University of Amsterdam. The Hot Politics Lab has been meeting for maybe 1.5 years now with weekly meetings. We typically have people in our, from the larger Amsterdam area to talk about political psychology. These can be people from political science departments, psychology departments, sociology, computer science departments. We've had pretty much everything, but now that we're all sort of stuck in our homes, we thought, why not open up to the rest of the world, and let's do these meetings online. So for the next weeks, we have a program set out. At the end of today's talk, we'll announce the next meeting as well. So today, a little bit about the format. We'll have a 15-minute talk by Michael Bang Petersen from Aarhus University. After the 15-minute talk, there's room for Q&A. On the bottom, for those like me who are very much unfamiliar yet with Zoom, on the bottom of your screen, there's this Q&A button. You see these two talking balloons. And if you hit that button, you can post your question there. And then when Michael is done, Bert and I will read out the questions that we received, and Michael will give answers. I give the floor now, the metaphorical floor, to Bert Bakker, who will introduce Michael Bang Petersen.
Yes, thank you. It's an honor to be able to introduce Michael Bang Petersen. As some of you might know, I did my PhD in Denmark, and at that point, Michael was already among the international rising stars in political science, and has ever since his importance and prominence in different fields has only been rising. Michael is a pioneer who tries to understand political attitudes and behavior by using insights from evolutionary psychology, but actually much broader. And as such, his work has appeared in every top journal in political science that you can think of, as well as journals such as Psychological Science, the Proceedings of the National Academy, and many more. Michael is a very creative researcher who is doing very topical research at the moment. So it's the best person to start this online Hot Politics Lab with. Also regarding the coronavirus, because the Carlsberg Foundation, yes, the foundation known for its beers, has funded Michael millions of kroners to do work in many countries on citizens' attitudes towards the coronavirus, while combining that with all sorts of information. So the news people consume, the on both social media and outside of social media. So it's an honor to have you here, Michael. I'm not going to talk any longer. The floor is yours now, and then afterwards we're opening up for Q&A.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Bert. I'm very happy to be here, and what I'll be talking about today, and I'll share some slides in a moment, is a bit different from what I'm normally talking about, because a lot of my substantive research is along the lines of the kind of research that is being done in the Hot Politics Lab, but that's not really what I'll be talking that much about here today. I'll also not present much data, if any. I think I will mention one data point at a certain point, but it's an unusual talk for me. So I hope you will bear with me, though. And it's much more, what you can say, normative or focused on what ought to be done than what I often do. What I'll try to do now is to share some slides. Right, just a second. Okay, are you able to see? No, you're not able. Well, just a second, I'll just try to do something else. Sorry. All right. Can you now see some PowerPoints? Yes, perfect. All right. So what I'll be talking about today is the importance of leadership during the particular crisis that we are in these days. And the focus is on both trying to understand some of the leadership decisions that were made in Denmark, and I think made other places, which I think were unfortunate, and then try to give my views about some of the lessons that we can learn from the current crisis that we are facing, about the importance of leadership and political communication. So first, a few words about the Danish case. So the way the government presented the corona infection here in Denmark was prior to March 6th. They basically said, well, it's like the flu. You shouldn't worry. It won't really come here. And then something happened. And March 6th, we saw that there was or the government announced at a press meeting led by the Prime Minister that we needed to ban all gatherings of more than 1,000 people. Then on March 6th, there was closing of schools and universities. March 11th, there was a closing of schools, universities, and also banning of gatherings more than 100 people. And then March 17th, there was closing of restaurants, bars, malls, small shops, and banning of gatherings over 10 people. So something happened very dramatically here as well as everywhere else. But there's two things that are worth mentioning. First of all, the very reluctant response in the beginning, especially prior to March 6th. And then also one of the things that got me sort of mobilized in this question is that the communication around March 6th was very weird, in the sense that they said we need to do something, but they didn't really tell why. They basically said we need to do something, but the most important thing is that you do not panic. So just for your information, I put the chart that shows the current case, or at least until March 18th for Denmark. This is the number of infected. This is the number of people in hospitals, and these are the number of deaths. So right now we are above 1,000 infected people, at least that the official authorities know of. They estimate that the actual number of infected is between 9,000 and 90,000. Which makes somewhat of a difference. Anyway, what I was interested initially was, why was there a slow response to this? Why was the initial communications focused on saying do not worry, it's just the flu. But also, why was there this communication mismatch prior to this March 11 press conference, where they said, well, you need to take precautions, but you shouldn't really worry too much about what's going on. And the conjecture that I have is that there is a deep fear in the public authorities for a public that is in panic. And it was very clear at the press meeting here in Denmark that they sort of repeatedly went back to say, you should not panic. But they didn't really tell us why we shouldn't panic, in the sense that it didn't tell us what the real problem was. And the real problem, of course, is that there could be a extreme overheating of and potential collapse of the hospital system, but they were not willing to say that initially, not before March 11. So I think, why is it that authority public? And I think here we have a combination of people with a background in political science, that's all the people who are advising the government, and then we have health researchers. And I think both of these groups, they have the sense that it's probably better to not tell the whole truth to people. Because one political science orthodoxy is that people are basically incompetent for democracy, so we shouldn't necessarily tell everything that we know, because we can't really expect people to deal with it. And also, the medical orthodoxy seems to be that when a patient comes into your practice, then you should tell them to take a painkiller and then just wait a little bit. So basically, keep calm and carry on. That's the best advice, because in most circumstances, that will in fact make whatever symptoms you have go away. So one of the first questions that I think is important to address is whether this fear of the public is warranted. And I think that the answer is no. We can in fact trust the public in general. First of all, if a severe crisis actually hits, then the major response is increased solidarity. So I don't know the situation in the Netherlands, but we have here in Denmark, we see this in sort of very low scale crisis situations when there's like a blizzard, and then suddenly people begin to talk to each other on the bus, in the bus stop, and so on. But we also know it from more from worse situations. So there's this study of the effect of the Wenchuan earthquake in China, where they found that people who were affected by the earthquake were much more pro-social in economic gains than people outside of the affected areas. Also, it might be true that when a crisis initially hits, there is some tendency for certain people to overreact and potentially react in negative ways. But what the findings is also from studies in crisis communication, but also some of the own stuff that I've done, is that people quickly find their balance. So we have this review of studies on terrorist attacks, where our basic message is that yes, people react in negative ways during terrorist attacks. That they, if it's a terrorist attack committed by Islamic fundamentalists, then we do see sometimes a harsher sentiments towards Muslims in the data, but it's something that very quickly fades again. One of the things that here in Denmark we've been talking a lot about, and I think also internationally, is on hoarding. And I think that's really what people, or that's really what authorities think of when they think about panic, is things like hoarding. But I think it's wrong to think about this as a panic reaction. It is basically a kind of rational response to this social dilemma that if everyone else is running down to the store, you need to move quickly as well. And I think the situation is that if supply lines are in fact intact, hoarding will quickly disappear, and that has been the experience that we have here in Denmark. I don't know how the situation is in the Netherlands, but I think because there are high levels of social trust and because supply lines are intact, then hoarding is not a problem over the long run. So one thing is that we shouldn't necessarily fear the public, but I think even if we are a little bit fearful of them, then it doesn't really matter, because we don't have any choice except actually to trust. I'm getting chat messages, but none that is important I see right now for me. In any case, so my point is that there's no, as a public authority in this situation, you have no other choice than to trust the public. So the first is that there's a normative reason that people do in fact have the right to know what are the facts about the current situation that they're facing. But also the situation is that an epidemic is a very unique form of a crisis. It cannot be solved by politicians while the rest of us sort of keep calm and carry on. A lot of the other kinds of crises that we have been facing over the last decades, they have been crises in the sense where politicians, like the financial crisis, could say, we'll solve this as long as you just don't really do anything. But an epidemic, that really requires public engagement, and it requires dramatic behavior change. And it does so in one of the most sort of fundamental areas of life for the social animal, namely social interaction. And also it needs to happen extremely fast because as I'm sure you have all seen the simulations, that it is really crucial that social distancing or physical distancing happens today rather than tomorrow. And it is basically what the healthy people do today that shapes the growth curve in the number of infected in 14 days. So you cannot keep calm and carry on in an epidemic, and the politicians cannot solve it by themselves. What they need to do is to motivate the public at a distance, and I believe that this requires them to tell them the uncomfortable truth. So one question is then, well, how can they actually do this? How can they take on a role as leaders? And one way that I've been trying to communicate this with some success to the Danish government is that they should think in terms of optimistic anxiety as the emotional target of their communication. And while what they worry about is fear, then we should actually think of anxiety as being our friend in need that is crucial in order to induce the behavior change. So we know from a lot of political science research, especially by George Marcus, that anxiety is very crucial in breaking habits and also in inducing information search, and that is sort of crucial in the current situation we are facing. Also, but on the other hand, you cannot just sort of do it with anxiety. You also, in order to have behavior change, you need to couple that anxiety with self-efficacy, some form of optimism, as you would say. And this is something that have been analyzed in risk communication in general. So here is one paper from one of my collaborators that shows this in the context of taking advice about how to deal with terrorist attacks. So how can you induce optimistic anxiety? And I think it requires extremely clear communication about how it is that citizens should behave. It requires extremely clear information about what happens if advice is not followed, which is what will induce anxiety, and also extremely clear communication about what happens if it is indeed followed and what will then create optimism. And I think one of of the fantastic science communication things that we have seen during this crisis is these sort of two curves, with the red and the green curve, where with the red curve we reach hospital capacity pretty quickly, but the green curve we can sort of get through it without too many problems. And I think that is very good for generating this optimistic anxiety. And this was one of the advice that I've been giving to the Danish government, and as a consequence, they actually have begun to using it in their official communication, that curve, or those pair of curves. So what are the dangers of communication? And I think one of the things that I constantly worry about, especially when I look at the Danish situation, is that there sometimes is a mismatch between what happens at the backstage and the front stage. That you have a sense that they are telling you one thing, and especially health authorities are telling you something with great certainty at the front stage, but at the same time you have the sense that they are pretty unsure what happens or what is going to happen when they talk to each other. And I think it's crucial that that authorities in such a crisis situation are truthful about the facts, and also are truthful about the inherent uncertainty that that they themselves experience. And I think the reason is that first of all, if you have unclear communication, then it demotivates compliance, which is crucial to actually deal with the epidemic, but also that unclear communication induces uncertainty in the sense of people begin to ask, what are they really up to? And one of the things that we know uncertainty facilitates is belief in conspiracy theories. Like here's just one study that shows that. And I think the reason why authorities are not always willing to put out all the uncomfortable facts is that they worry about panic. And the reason why they do not want to tell about their own uncertainty is that they worry about creating uncertainty. But I think the key point is that it's actually not expressions of uncertainty that induces uncertainty in audiences, but uncertainty happens when audiences are not able to square what they hear with what they observe. So if they get conflicting advice from different health authorities, if they can see that their national health authority tackle this in another way than other authorities, and so forth. So I think clear communication is crucial, but it's also important to note that a crisis, and especially the COVID-19 crisis that we're facing right now, has a different set of phases, and that different types of communication is crucial in the different phases. So the first phase is what we are, where we are in now, where it's very important to produce anxiety such that we see this disruption of habits and create, which will create physical distance. But we're also moving slowly into the second phase, where we are experiencing long-term isolation. And especially like here in Denmark, we have been more or less isolated for 1 week, and it's already having it's already being somewhat of a burden. And what is important in this second phase is the formation of new habits, habits that will actually help you cope with the problems that you are facing in terms of loneliness, which will be even more severe as the death toll will begin to rise. And one sort of catchphrase is that the greater physical distance, the greater the social closeness needs to be. So as also Nicholas Christakis have been out arguing on Twitter, then the concept of social distancing is very unfortunate, because it's physical distancing that's key, and we actually need to be closer socially more now than ever. So here in this situation, anxiety is counterproductive, and it's something that we need to learn to deal with, and leaders need to try to help people get into habits that will help them maintain social closeness at a distance. The third phase, who knows when that will arrive, is the opening of society, where we have a re-emergence of old habits. And what will be crucial, I think, for the second phase is that that authorities begin to talk about this third phase and say, well, what is the plan exactly? What are the decision criteria that we'll be using for how to open up society again? So just some final general reflections. I think what has been clear to me in this process is that while this is a medical or health research issue in an obvious way, then really the need for behavioral research is greater, or is really the need for behavioral research is huge in order to understand an epidemic, because you cannot just deal with an epidemic by tracking data on the infected, because the problem is not so much the infected, but it's actually the behavior of the healthy. So government should invest much more in figuring out how are the populations doing, and I've been like surprised why authorities have not been using all the classical tools that they know from the campaign, from their political campaigns during elections, to like send out massive surveys or mobilize people who have behavioral data, like phone companies and so on, to see, well, how much are people actually moving around. So the crucial problem in order to fix an epidemic is actually more of a social science problem, both in terms of getting behavioral data, but also in terms of figuring out how to communicate in the right way. Then it's a classical health research problem. I think one reason why this has not been clear to at least Danish authorities, and I should say that one goal of this grant that I just gave, or that I just got, is in fact to do the behavioral research and provide that input to the government. But I think one reason why the government is not in itself able to think out of the box is that we have an overheated decision-making system right now. Like we're talking a lot about an overheated hospital system, but right now the problem is an overheated decision-making system. So crazily huge decisions are taken from minute to minute about lockdown and so on. And I cannot imagine people who are more stressed out than the decision makers and the bureaucracy, and that is something that hinders their ability to integrate new information. It's a situation where personalities and the particular mental models that they have will rule. So what we have been trying to do here in Denmark is to, or what I've been trying to do together with others, is to say, well, okay, we understand that you can't innovate right now, that you can't integrate new information, but that is what we can do. So we are willing to basically take some of those tasks and help you with it and provide you with those kinds of analysis. And speaking of these mental models, one of the things that I've been kind of baffled about is how the mental model seems to differ across different health authorities, and how they seem to actually shape the way that we are dealing with the corona epidemic. It seems that Asia is combating SARS and are drawing on the experiences that they had in that regard. That's why they had extremely quick shutdown, and why the public was also extremely willing to engage in that. A lot of the advice from the World Health Organization is explicitly referencing Ebola about how you need to constantly be on the move, constantly take decisions, and so on. And at the same time, then we're seeing that Europe is combating not Ebola and not SARS, but they're combating the flu. So there is, at least in the Danish, the materials from the Danish health authorities, there's this constant reference back to what we know about how the flu works as an epidemic. But who knows whether that's a good model for what happens here. So the final point is back to the notion on crisis communication. And I think it's really clear that health authorities are terrible at it. So political authorities, they can do it if they're willing to do it, but the health authorities are not very good at it because they still operate in this sort of keep calm and carry on kind of model where they are saying, well, we have it under control, do not worry. But it's pretty clear, I think, that this is a situation that involves a lot of uncertainty where the health authorities actually cannot know what will happen in the future. And I think one spin on this is that it's perhaps not so surprising that they're not good in crisis communication, because what they learn in medical school is this psychology of how you deal with a patient in a one-to-one meeting, where the whole focus is on calming down the patient and said, it will all be good. Let's just wait a little bit. But I think when it comes to crisis communication, then that kind of model is part of the problem and not the solution. And with that, I want to say thank you very much. And yes, I'm happy to answer whatever questions that you have. It should be said that I'm really no expert on the corona virus, but I'm a political psychologist and who got entangled in this crisis due to a Twitter rant that went viral in Denmark and led to me advising the government and now me doing research on it, all within 2 weeks.
Thanks a lot, Michael. I think this is the part where we do a big applause, but then we have to put all the mics open. And actually, there are currently 63 people listening in. And if I look at the list of participants, I think a panel at ISPP would be jealous with the current list of participants. I wanted to start with a question by myself, but there is already a brilliant question posed by Martin Rosema from the University of Twente. The question is, what do you consider to be the potential contribution or perhaps even professional or moral duty of political scientists and experts in political psychology in the current situation? To the other people listening in, use the Q&A box to write down your question, and I will try to moderate this discussion. So, Michael, did you have an answer to Martin? Or
yeah, well, first of all, hi, Martin. Hope you're well. I think that the biggest contribution is probably in terms of political communication, trying to sort of figure out what is the kind of communication that is important in these circumstances, and it is really a novel situation for most of us, at least for me. I was born in 1980, and life has been pretty sweet, living in a Danish welfare state. Like no real problems have been facing society, and I think, therefore, we don't know much about how to actually operate in a democracy, or how political elites operate in the best way in a democracy in a severe crisis. And I think this is an opportunity for testing it, but it's also an opportunity where we can say, well, based on our best knowledge of what the literature says, then these are our advice. But I think there will be a lot of research to do in the aftermath of this, and trying to figure out how should governments really communicate in this situation.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Then another question. I think a lot of people, in particular, non-political psychologists, are surprised about the role of anxiety. And we know the literature, anxiety leads to information search, but is there also a risk that anxiety makes people focus too much, particularly on fake news?
So I think if you look at the predictors of fake news sharing, I think the biggest predictor is not so much anxiety. There's some like uncertainty, but it is indeed a predictor. But I think there's important differences between anxiety and uncertainty, because you can be anxious without any uncertainty at all. Like if you're absolutely clear that something bad will happen, then you will be anxious. So I think there are distinct psychological concepts, and while uncertainty is a predictor, then anxiety is, as far as I know the data, less so. What I think is the big, from the studies that I've been doing on fake news sharing, then a lot of fake news sharing is really motivated by more immediate political goals, that people strategically select fake news stories that they can use to further their political goals, either partisan goals or more disruptive goals of burning down society. And I think these are more important for fake news sharing. I think what is the problem with an epidemic or a crisis such as the current one is that it does serve as a focal point for fake news sharing, because a lot of everyone's attention is focused on this crisis, and therefore if you are a political entrepreneur with evil intentions, then you will in some way attach your political agenda to that crisis and potentially use it to spread misinformation.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions now from the audience. First question by Hannah Werner, also from the University of Amsterdam. She asks, do we know already what drives compliance with measures such as social distancing on the demand side, from the citizen side, other than, say, institutional trust?
Thanks very much. So we have been collecting data on this in Denmark over the past week. We can see that the biggest non-compliers here in Denmark is young men with low incomes. So it fits my general maxim that everything problematic is more pronounced in young males, and also non-compliance with authorities in this situation. In terms of, I've seen some data on personality as well, and what we see there is that non-compliers are, of course, I almost said, are higher in the dark triad. So they have malicious personalities, but it's not just sort of being social. It's in fact also being social. So people who are high in extroversion, they comply a lot less. And of course, the way to understand compliance with in this situation is a matter of like what are the costs and what are the benefits. And if you are a young extroverted person, then you are paying a lot of costs by engaging in social distancing, because if you're a young person, what you want to do is you want to hang out with your friends and you want to hug and kiss, and at the same time you are not paying a lot of or you're not getting a lot of benefits from engaging in social distancing because you yourself do not have very big or a lot of risks of a serious infection. So I think rational choice in some versions tells us a lot about who it is that are compliant and who isn't.
Okay, thanks. Next question is from Jeroen van Baar from Brown University, and he asks, how much anxiety is the right amount of anxiety in phase 1, and how can we determine what the right amount of anxiety is?
Well, I think the right amount of anxiety is whatever anxiety level of anxiety matches the situation that we're facing. I think that, of course, when anxiety spills over into actual stress reactions, such as being unable to sleep and so on, then we're over the top. But it does also, coming back to the question about compliance, what we can see is in our data is that anxiety about the epidemic is a huge predictor, of course, of compliance. So if you do want to create rapid compliance, then high levels of anxiety is necessary. And I'm as long as it doesn't create stress reactions, then I'm less worried about anxiety if it's coupled with optimism. So the Danish data that we have there, we do see that the Danish public is very high in anxiety, but they're actually equally high in optimism. And we have seen some changes over the past week where people become a little bit more anxious, but then they actually also in the following day become a bit more optimistic. So it really seems that these two things can go hand in hand, and as long as they do that, I think we are on the safer side at least. But of course, it's a difficult question. But yeah.
Okay, now Bert Bakker has a question. Bert.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, Michael, could you? So this is really interesting, that your response to the last question, because how I've always understood anxiety within political psychology is that it's an information processing, relevant for information processing, but not so much to get people to do things. But so is it now the optimism that gets people to comply, or is it the anxiety? And if so, would there be ways to disentangling this? Like, from an advising point of view, you would say, well, who cares as long as people comply? But for the sort of theoretical puzzle, I could see there's some interesting work to be done there.
No, that's actually a very good point, and I haven't looked into it in our data yet, but it's I do. So the way that I think about it conceptually is related to what you are saying, but it doesn't. But I think the problem here is that you need to get people to do two things. They need to engage in social distancing, but in order to do that, they need to break the normal habits. So in that sense, I think the main function of anxiety is this break function, where you said, well, I need to stop doing with what I normally do, and I need to search, get information about what I should be doing. And then I do believe that the optimism is what in the end is the actual driver of the behavior. So I think it's a very good point.
Okay, now I have a question from Christian.
I would like to ask a little bit of a practical question in designing such a message that creates anxiety. Because, as you said, there's a large amount of people that is not directly affected individually, younger people, more healthy people, etc. So if you want them to break their habits and to change their behavior, you need a message that targets them as well, even though that this collective risk does not affect them as much. how can you create a message that you broadcast that where you can't address people individually? How to create such a message that addresses both the wider public, but also specifically creates this kind of anxiety among the people that are less affected?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think maybe anxiety is not the way to reach everyone. That there is like a second kind of strategy that you can engage in, which I call moralization, because the people who are not personally affected and for whom it can be difficult to reach by these sort of anxiety-inducing messages, what you might be able to do is instead to create a message or a signal that you need to think about your behavior in relation to infection in the same way that you think about, for example, your behavior with regards to smoking. So one of the things that I've been sort of found interesting is how rapidly people's understanding or perception of things like passive smoking, or what is the English, whatever the English word for it, but the smoke that you expose other people to by smoking, that seems to be very quickly moralized in across Western societies. And that led to rapid behavior change a lot of places. And the basic message was there that, well, what you're doing when you're smoking is that you are hurting other people. And I think that there is some potential to reach people through that kinds of messages too. But what you need to do is to say, well, what are the norms that make you a good member of the group, and which will give you status within the group? And here the prime minister is probably not the right one to create norms within groups of young people. There you need to find sources that can appeal to them. So the Danish government have been trying to team up with social media influencers and who then could sort of send out the messages from the government to their audiences. Today, I've also been talking about or talking with like an actor group who are doing sort of horror shows about how they could create small videos that potentially could appeal more to young males than social media influencers and also the prime minister. So I think what the politicians need to do is that they need to think about this in the same way that they think about their campaign strategies, to think about what kind of communication devices can we use to reach audiences that are hard to reach. And medical authority doesn't work on everyone, for sure.
Thank you, Michael. I have two questions about the same topic. First posed by Amanda Friesen from Indiana University, Purdue University at Indianapolis. She says, in the US, we are seeing a polarized response to the seriousness of the pandemic. Speaking about your research on pathogens and in-group and out-groups, how would you interpret the response of American conservatives being less concerned than progressives? And Hannah Werner added to this, and what about Europe?
Yeah, so the situation in United States is well interesting from a research perspective, because there is this polarization fueled by, I think, Donald Trump's stance on the epidemic at least initially. So I very much agree. So maybe I should tell people a little bit about what I've been doing on research on with regards to pathogen discussed. But one of the things that we are finding is that people who more generally worry about pathogens and infections, that they tend to lean conservative, especially on social issues. And of course, that clashes a little bit with what we're seeing, or that does clash with what we're seeing in United States, where it's Democrats rather than Republicans that engages in these behaviors that will decrease infection. And so that's the point is that this the reason why we see this polarization can be explained with the polarization fueled by Trump, but of course that looks weird given what we are finding on the relationship between ideology and pathogen discussed. So I think that my collaborator Ben Arsenault, he sort of made the point on Twitter that the reason is that the corona epidemic hasn't really activated the behavioral immune system or the pathogen avoidance system yet in conservatives. So the way our minds have been designed to avoid infections is not to avoid these sort of super contagious pathogens that we're seeing today, but more to react to very clear physical signs of infection, such as rashes or open wounds or rotten food. And as long as conservatives are not seeing them, then we do not see the normal pathogen response. So his prediction is that as more and more get infected, and as conservatives will in fact see in their home environment people who do have symptoms, then we might see a reversal such that conservatives very quickly begin to take precautions.
Okay, thanks a lot, Michael. I have another question by Roman Chuchel, also from the University of Amsterdam. He says, I wonder a bit how you would navigate officials giving out bad or even misinformation. On the one hand, we want people to follow their government's advice. On the other hand, if they are stoking fears or false hopes, e.g. certain presidents, we are in a dilemma.
Yes. That's very true. So I do think that we in these situations need to speak truth to power. I think we in a crisis situation we need to perhaps do more than what we would normally do in terms of engaging directly in public debate. And I think it's our responsibility as scientists to try to do as much as we can to set the record straight about what are the facts. So that would be my take on the point that if authorities put out misinformation, then it's our duty to respond.
Okay, Michael, final question from Honorata Mazepus. First, I want to apologize to all the people that still have questions, but we won't have time for them because all four of us need to, I think, well, no, all three of us, I think, need to resume our duties as fathers at 4 o'clock. But I will save all these questions, and maybe Michael can address them at a later stage. So a last question from Honorata Mazepus. A couple of days ago, Merkel said that this epidemic is the biggest challenge for social solidarity in Germany since the Second World War. Do you think giving positive examples of social solidarity could be a good way of creating desirable responses? What would work, and who would respond to those, and how? That's a very short question.
No, that's a very, very good question. So I'm mostly following the Danish situation on these kinds of like in terms of the public mood, but now we will collect data from today in other countries as well. But so what I see, at least from Denmark, is that there's not a problem with solidarity, rather the opposite. That people are very, very willing to support society, support the government, and so support each other. And so how can you facilitate that also in other countries? And I think basically what one should do is to look at the literature on cooperation, and what we know is the biggest predictor of cooperation from, for example, behavioral economics is whether other people cooperate and whether there is a sanctioning system. So I think what one should promote examples of is other people, that other people are engaging in solidarity. I think the media stories that focus a lot on other kinds of behavior and also focuses on hoarding and so on, I think they are counterproductive. I think a main focus should be on all the positive social acts that are happening. But also, I think focusing on the disapproval that people have against sort of non-altruistic acts or behavior that is not altruistic, I think that's important too. I think focusing on that there is a sanctioning system in place, and focusing on the fact that other people are engaging in pro-social ways, I think those are at least the most important messages from the cooperation literature.
Okay, thank you, Michael. We're running close to 4 o'clock. I want to first of all thank you, Michael, for taking the time in this incredibly busy period to speak to us. I think for me it once more illustrates the richness of your embedment within all sorts of disciplines within the social sciences, and how you apply this to this hot topic at the moment is very inspiring. Also want to thank and disappoint at the same time the people that asked the question that we couldn't answer, among others Alex Blanchett, Timothy Dorr, Maurits Meijers, Francine Marquand, Courtney Crosby, Nikolai Burke, and I forget a couple. I think we could continue for another hour, but we're going to round up here. To me, this worked really well. We had an incredibly high number of participants, 65 listening almost throughout the whole hour. So that's thanks to you, Michael. I also want to do a shout out to Christian People, who has been organizing all the technicalities of this online webinar with Zoom. And obviously also Gijs Schumacher, with whom it's always a pleasure to organize things like this. Finally, let me conclude that we're going to continue this series of speakers relevant to the Corona crisis. So next week at 3 o'clock, same time, we have Stuart Soroka, who's a professor of communication science and political science at the University of Michigan, zooming in with us to talk about the rousing nature of negative news and the maybe the future of positivity as well there. So we'll speak directly to some of your arguments as well, Michael. For now, I want to thank everybody for being here. We're going to try to save the questions for you, Michael, so that we can at least send them to you. Well, I hope we're going to see more of this project coming soon. So a big round of applause in the digital world. Can we make Klappen? We're, at least from me and my son. So that's great. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you, everyone.
Dank u, Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.